All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this hearing of the Budget and Finance Committee for Monday, December 14th, 2015. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the Committee. I'm joined by Council Members Koretz and Blumenfield, and we're ready to begin with today's agenda items. I'd like to take up first general public comment. Is there anybody in the audience wishing to offer general public comment? Do we have any general public comment cards?
No cards, sir.
General public comment is closed. Members, I'd like to propose items 6, 7, and 8 as consent items unless you have questions or concerns. Seeing none, do we have any cards on those matters?
No cards on those items.
Public comment on those matters is closed and those matters are approved. 6 and 7 are approved on consent. Item 8 is noted and filed. We're going to go next to our closed session agenda. Is there anyone wishing to speak on items 1 or 2 on the closed session agenda? I see no one. Are there any cards?
There are no cards.
1 or 2? 1 or 2? No? Okay. Seeing none, public comment on those matters is closed, and we will now proceed to closed session. I guess this wrong most of the time, but I think we'll move fewer people if we go to the other room. So let's go to the other room for closed session. We'll hear item. City Attorney, have a preference on priority? All right, thank you for your patience, everyone, and we're now back on our regular agenda. Next item is item number 3.
Item number 3 is continued from December 7th, 2015. It's a City Administrative Officer report relative to a 4th amendment to the contract with Motorola Solutions for installation of communications equipment at Northeast Areas Police Station and as-needed technical and communication services.
Thank you. And before you begin, we do have one card on, still only one card on this, so I'd like to invite up Dr. Molly Rhodes to provide her comment before we begin. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Just briefly, we have some transparency concerns about this item in 2 dimensions. One, on the $6 million, I can't really tell what it's going to. You may have those concerns as well. And secondly, this is an outsourcing renewal. I don't believe we received a notification of intent to contract on it. I have no memory of receiving one. We're supposed to get them on contract renewals as well as regular contracts. So I just wanted to flag that. We're not looking to blow anything up, but we need to get notice on everything. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Go right ahead.
Thank you. Maggie Goodrich, CIO for the LAPD.
Tyler Munhall, CAO.
The contract before you is an amendment to an existing agreement with Motorola to do 2 things. One is to add funding to install radio equipment in the new Northeast Station that is just being completed. And the other is to add $6 million in contingency. The scope of work is not attached for that $6 million as of yet. We're still working with the CAO for the allocations of funding, and those funding allocations will come to council as appropriate as they are decided. But the work breakdown for the $6 million would include about $1.5 million. That would be for the replacement of our voice loggers in the 911 dispatch center. So that is the logger that records each 911 call. An upgrade and replacement of that is required. And the remainder of that would be for an upgrade to our existing computer-aided dispatch system. We are on a previous version of the Motorola Cad, or computer-aided dispatch system. We are due an upgrade to that system. The existing software licensing for that system allows us to receive the upgraded software at no additional cost, but it will require some professional services on the part of Motorola to get it installed and configured and swap out some hardware and things like that. But it is a significant savings in that if we upgrade to the latest version of the Motorola CAD, the total like I said, will be about $4.5 million if we were to try to replace the CAD outright. There are other jurisdictions, larger agencies doing that for anywhere between $20 and $40 million. So we'd prefer to upgrade in place.
Mr. Blumenfield?
What are the funding sources? You said we haven't been identified yet, but what are the potential funding sources for the $6 million?
Prop M is typically the primary source of funding for anything dispatch related, and then anything that might qualify for MICLA as well. And of course, those would come to council.
Mr. Bonin? Mr. Kretz?
So, just out of curiosity, why wasn't a notification issued on contracting out on this item?
My understanding is the 1022 notification was issued as it pertains to the Motorola contract.
The Motorola,
Dismissed somehow?
well, the services are proprietary to Motorola also. So I will have to check with the personnel department, but I believe because it's a proprietary system, Motorola employees have to do the work.
We are only talking about work here that can be justified as sole source to Motorola, in that it's specific to the understanding of the inner workings of their specific system to be able to install. I don't have city staff that could actually do any of this work. And in fact, where we do have city staff that can do the work, we do that ourselves.
But we are supposed to notify, and it's not clear whether you did or not. Obviously, the recipients didn't receive it or didn't spot it or whatever, so somehow something went awry.
I can certainly look into that with the CAO and respond back to that. I believe we have a placeholder for this in full council tomorrow, so we can come with more information on that tomorrow.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
So I'm struggling a little with the investment in the CAD upgrade, because I know that we're still a long way off from figuring out where we need to be with the CAD upgrade and the interface with the fire department, and still a lot of policy development work that has to be done in that, as I understand it. And I guess I'm concerned that if we move forward with this, are we making a commitment that might take us in a particular policy direction that we have not yet made a decision about? And might that turn out not to be the most cost-effective way to go? I get that there's savings in doing the upgrade as opposed to a new system, but I have no idea about the operability of that and its use with the fire department and all of the other issues that still haven't been resolved.
Sure. So this upgrade is required for the police department no matter what is decided in terms of a CAD for the fire department. The bottom line is today, the existing police department CAD, the older version of Motorola that we're on, will not support the fire department. So even if the fire department wanted to join the police department's CAD as a subscriber, for example, today actually in our existing version of police CAD, it wouldn't support it.
Right.
Going forward, the police department needs to upgrade its CAD no matter what the fire department decides to do, because it needs to come up to the latest version of that CAD. The fire department exercise that's ongoing at the moment, and I'm also leading that effort, is to do an analysis of the fire department's requirements for dispatch. We've actually released an RFI for a fire CAD. We have responses coming back in January in response to that RFI. We'll be doing a market analysis of the fire department's dispatch requirements. We're also going through a process with a consulting group to detail out the fire department's dispatch requirements in very sort of low-level detail. And then we'll be doing a comparison of the fire department's dispatch requirements with the proposals that come in response to that RFI, as well as LAPD's upgraded Motorola CAD. So we'll be doing a comparison there to determine, can the upgraded Motorola CAD meet the needs of the fire department, or if not, would the fire department need to go with one of those other solutions? If the answer is that it needs to go with another solution, then we'll issue a full RFP for a fire CAD. But no matter what the decision is on the fire side, the police department will need to move to the latest version.
Clearly so. I guess what I'm saying is, let's suppose that in response to your RFI and RFP on the fire department, let's suppose that you get back a proposal that says we can meet all of the fire department's needs for X dollars, and we can meet the fire department's needs and upgrade PD's CAD for X plus $3 million. So now we've already upgraded for $4.5 million when we could have done that for an incremental increase of something less than $4.5 million. Is there any scenario by which that kind of thing could happen?
I don't see any scenario by which that could happen because the only vendor that can actually upgrade the police department CAD is Motorola because it is their proprietary product. So I can't see that any other vendor would actually be able to say they could upgrade the CAD in place. What you are describing would basically require a complete replacement of the PD CAD and the fire CAD at the same time.
Right.
A large endeavor that some other cities have taken on to the tune of $40 to $60 million and not been very successful at trying to do both departments at once. So
Okay.
from a technical perspective and operational perspective, I would recommend that we separate them out no matter what anyway to ensure successful implementation and upgrade.
Okay. And, okay, so I think you've already answered the competitive bidding question. This component of it, at least this $6 million, the $1.5 million for the voice logger, that also is proprietary.
Correct.
So all of the additional $6 million can be sole sourced to Motorola because they're the only ones providing.
Correct. And each of those pieces of work will be reviewed by the city attorney before it's authorized for that verification. If there is any of that work that is not proprietary to Motorola and not able to be sole sourced, then it will not be. And then we would go out to bid for any particular piece of work.
Okay.
So it would only be for the pieces of work that are proprietary.
All right, well, I think, members, just so that we don't lose sight of some of these policy considerations, and your explanation makes sense to me, and I think it's unlikely that we would realize a cost efficiency greater than this, but I think we still need to stay in the loop on this and make sure that we are doing this in a cost-effective way. So what I'd like to do is, unless there's an objection, propose that we authorize the contract and ask for a report back prior to exercising the additional $6 million in authority, a report back with some itemization of those expenditures and how they correlate to the larger CAD upgrade.
Happy to do that.
Okay. Any objection to that? All right, then that'll be the action of the committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That brings up item number 4.
Item number 4.
I'm sorry, one other thing. Going back to item 3. Next generation 911.
Yes.
How are we doing on that? And how does that relate to the upgrade of the voice logger?
So this CAD upgrade is actually required to enable us to go to next gen 911.
Okay.
Our current platform will not support next gen 911.
Okay,
So this
and
is
the
the
new-
next step in that regard.
And the voice logger in 911, is that limited only to voice, or would that encompass some of the transmissions that you would get under next gen 911 too, like texts and data submissions, that
Right,
sort of thing?
right now, that's just an upgrade to the existing voice, but certainly considerations will be made for next gen as we move through the CAD upgrade.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, item number 4.
Item number 4 is the CAO report in response to a motion from Corey and Cedillo relative to citywide liability claims payouts status and cost of risk analysis report.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Ed Rose with the CIO's office. The report before you is a report that provides a historical data from the past 5 years as it relates to liability claims and payouts throughout the city. These are general fund expenditures, and we provide this is an informational report, and we provide information as far as type of claims and by city departments. We also include a discussion on the CAO's cost of risk analysis, which provides additional data and different categories of claims made before the city. We also have a chart that goes in a little bit of detail on by each department as far as a historical perspective. And it should be noted that the numbers, even though they are compiled for the past 5 years, these may have resulted in cases that have just settled now but have occurred several years ago, and they're just being reflected on our data right now. So again, these are from informational purposes, and we have our staff here if you'd like to follow up with any questions.
And I just want to add, the reason why this information came forward at this time is because of the fact that in the second financial status report, as you heard here, there was a significant increase in what we reported as liability claims that could potentially be paid out this fiscal year. So if you recall, in the first financial status report, we said that the trends were showing over expenditures in that account of about $20 million. But based on more recent information from the city attorney's office with regard to potential dollar value of cases that could be settled or go to trial, and there could be a judgment this current fiscal year, we're looking at a number of closer to $80 million more than what was budgeted in our liability account. So that prompted a lot of questions. I'm sure there's a lot of questions that you have, but what we wanted to do is provide some historical information with regard to the liability claims account, and just some additional information with regard to the departments where the liabilities are rising from.
So, members, there's some short-term and some long-term considerations that are raised by this. The short-term is we're way beyond where we thought we would be in the budget for liability claims, or we project to the end of the year that we would be. And so that's a significant short-term concern, but I think this report is a good first step in trying to break that down to be able to identify where are the problem areas that are fixable, because this is one of the areas where we really don't necessarily need to accept continuing increase in the liability obligations of the city. We can actually turn this around to some extent. We're never going to get rid of all of our liabilities, but with different management practices in some of our departments, I think we can do a much more effective job of managing our risk and reducing our risk. So that's the point of this. Matt, has my motion actually been heard by council yet? Not yet. Okay, so what this this is a first step. I think we should have some discussion as much as you'd like right now, but also know that after my motion comes back from council, we'll have a much more detailed report really breaking this down over the course of a number of years so that we can see trend lines and so forth, and get into it at greater length so that it'll come back here again. But at least on this report, let's go ahead and start the discussion. Mr. Kratz.
I'm just curious, with the preliminary work we've done, have we found patterns that we can potentially break and not have this continuing increase?
I mean, obviously, there's some departments where there's a lot of liability being that's rising from. You note that in one of our charts, and we have police department and street services and DOT as the top three departments where the total payouts by departments for the last 4 years has been the greatest. So in some of those cases, and you hear those cases, as you go to the back and discuss, are employment related. Some of those are use of force. Some of those are conditions of the street. It's only departments can really attest to what they're doing with regard to limiting the future liability and the risk associated with those types of cases. All we're doing in this report is presenting where the payouts have come from, and that this doesn't even capture everything as far as payouts, because, as you know, in some cases, in some employment-related cases, the payouts are, for example, back wages, which come out of department salary accounts, and that's not incorporated in here. This is just strictly payouts that were made from the liability accounts. And so that's why it's a very preliminary look. Once the chairperson's motion gets approved and we're instructed to, we'll be digging a little bit deeper with the state attorney's office and providing more detailed information as to perhaps, what you're asking about.
So we haven't yet identified bad practices to correct or anything from this process yet?
Not from this process. I'm sure there's been bad practices, as you state, identified from specific cases that I hope departments have really looked at and try to provide the fixes. But in this report, we don't really address any of those practices.
One of the more useful tools we have, our risk management group is working on, is a risk management information system, which tracks data and cases on a more timely fashion as when they occur, instead of years later when they're settled. This way, you can better identify, and more useful tool to identify practices. And it may be a training issue. It could be a sidewalk that needs to be repaired, or intersection that's dangerous. It enables the city to be more proactive in addressing the real root cause of the claim, instead of just letting it fester and have repeated claims one on top of the other.
I mean, just in my own head, it seems like there are a lot of retaliation cases where either retaliation actually does occur or the appearance occurs and leads to litigation. Certainly seems like something we could do better training for management across the board on.
Well, and there is mandatory
issues.
required training that all supervisors are supposed to take with regard to harassment and retaliation, and that's something that's required of all supervisors in the city. So, I mean, there is some training in place, but you're right. There's probably a need for more focused, perhaps, in some units or departments.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be nipping it yet. We still have more of those cases than I think we need to.
And it should also be noted that sometimes it's not that we have a lot of cases. It's just that we have one bad mistake that results in a mammoth liability that skews these statistics entirely. And we can all think of, a number of examples off the top of our head in a number of departments where one mistake, one time when a manager should have consulted with the city attorney's office in advance but didn't, or should have consulted with personnel in advance but didn't, those sorts of things, or HR, and we get hit with a big judgment. And I think this exercise hopefully will be instructive to our managers too, to realize that we'll all have much better budget health for all of our departments if we don't make those kinds of mistakes. Mr. Blumenfield.
I completely agree with you, and I think this is a really important step, taking your motion in this report and focusing on our liabilities, because it's one of those areas that the more we put in, we can just save the city money. We can actually put into services. It's just such a waste of money, every time we go into closed session and pay out, these cases, case after case. I'm curious on the LAPD numbers, how we compare. It's good to see the trend lines, but it would also be good to see a comparison, I guess not just LAPD, but all across the board with other comparable departments in other cities. How do we compare to New York regarding liability payments? Do you guys know that? Is that?
Not off the top. It's definitely something that we could explore further as we continue working on this. As we stated, this is our preliminary attempt at some data gathering. We'll do some more data gathering, but really the important aspect of what comes out of this would be the analytics that comes from that, looking at the data to see where we could address some additional resources with regard to training and so forth.
I'd love to, I don't know if I need to do that formally or just ask for it, but I'd love to see benchmarks for other cities on
Sure.
across the board on these liability issues, because that's, some of this we may be going up and down because of a national trend, and it's nothing to do with us. It has to do with the zeitgeist of the times that we're getting more lawsuits on a particular personnel matter. and you want to factor those out and try to see what makes us different. So that would be important to me to see that happen. Now, the City Risk Management Division has been in place for a while, right? How long has that been?
I personally don't know off the top of my head. We have our risk manager here that could come up and maybe talk a little bit more in depth about their unit.
Victor Parker, CAO. I mean, risk management in the city, I guess I'll be the historian, because I haven't been here for that as long, but it started in the 1980s, and it's, we take care of, I mean, you're focusing on liability and evaluating what trends and where we can do better. That's part of what we do, but we do all the risk financing for the city. We run insurance and bonds compliance, we have bonding programs, we do quite a few other things. So, but we do cost of risk analysis for the departments, and the reports that we show in this are really for our departments, and we continue to work with them day in and day out on that analysis. But I'll give my opportunity to make my pitch because Mr. Rose already said it. We really want to implement an analytic tool, a risk management information system that would integrate liability claims and workers' comp claims and bring it to real time, which we don't have now. So I think that would help really great in the analytics and everybody understanding it. And the departments, they don't have excuses. They can't say, well, I don't know what claims I have or don't have, because it'll be at their fingertips with technology today. So we have that piece of it that we really want to push forward right now.
I mean, that's great. And I fully support that. I think we all do. I think that's. What kind of metrics have we been using for these last 10 years to get us to where we are, particularly on the liability side?
Well, we have almost exclusively used just payouts. I mean, when after they're paid out, and I think as a professional risk manager, I want to know what's happening now, and I want to know as soon as it's happened so we can prevent it as fast as possible. And that's what departments need to know too. They need to know how they compare themselves from year to year, month to month, week to week, and then we can implement programs immediately if we see any trends developing. But I would say mostly the metrics that the city has used is just based on payouts.
Which we recognize is not the best metric. We recognize it.
I mean, it's important to track that.
It's
Yeah, no,
yeah, but it's
Really,
it's
other
not the
things we
best.
should be looking at.
Yeah, it's not the best in that a lot of these cases where the payouts are occurring today occurred 5 or even longer. So, we're making the payouts today for mistakes that were done maybe 5 or 10 years ago or even longer.
Well,
So-
and a lot of the degree of the payout depends on the vagaries of, who the attorney is, where it was resolved in litigation, what kind of aberrational thing a jury does, and a million other things that don't really give us any indication of a measurable analytical tool to judge our performance by. A jury verdict is the worst measure of our performance, probably, because it depends on a million things. What are some of the other things? Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, Mr. Bloomfield, but one of the things I asked for in the motion is number of claims filed, for example, not just amounts paid, but just the number of claims over a course of years and broken down by particular areas. Resolution of those claims, number of cases filed, resolution of those cases, which went to trial, which were settled. Breaking it down that way, I think, gives us a bit of a fuller picture. But what are some of the other tools that we should have you report to us about so that we can get a better measure of those trend lines?
I think there's a lot of kind of risk management industry metrics that we can bring forth in a report. Cost per claim. You do it based on how severe the claim was, but the frequency is another thing that departments really need to look at, because you made a very good point about what happens once a claim happens. It goes to a trial or go to a jury or whatever. But the idea is that it needs to be stopped. That's what they need to focus on. They can say, well, that was because that jury did this or did that, but the incident happened. Why did it happen? We have to develop programs around that to combat that before they become a claim, even so. But there's a lot of standard metrics that we can bring forward along with the ones that you suggest.
Great. So you know what we're after. You've heard that. I don't want the report to be limited necessarily to what we're specifically asking for here. I think we're looking for your best professional judgment on how we assess this. And so if there's things in addition to this that you want to throw in there, by all means, it's going to be welcome, Mr. Koretz.
One thing I don't know if we've tracked or taken a look at, I know it's important in workers' comp particularly, is how aggressive we are at responding to claims, and in the case of workers' comp, dealing with injuries before they get litigated. Because obviously any case that you can take care of before you reach that stage, it's going to be a much smaller case and probably much more helpful more quickly to the person filing the case, especially in workers' comp, who initially they usually just look at getting better quickly. It's usually when there's some dissatisfaction that things start to blow up.
Mr. Blumenfield?
Continue, or were you continuing?
Yeah, that's my only question.
I was talking before about comparing us to other cities in terms of the numbers. I'd also like to see, compare us, are there any cities that are doing it right? What is out there, are there some cities that have just this, bang up risk management tools that they're using with best practices that we could take advantage of? And locally, are there other, county sheriffs, et cetera, are there folks that we should be partnering with on some of this stuff? Because this goes beyond our city. So when we look at this, I definitely want to see that spectrum. And another piece, the employment and employees. We had lots of cases as recently as 5-10 minutes ago, where we're talking about the fact that employees are costing us money in certain cases where they're with bad management. So do we do risk assessment about employee characteristics and particularly about how something that's come up recently is how we grade or how the reports about employees. It's often been said nobody ever wants to say anything bad about an employee, and then that employee a couple of years down the road ends up suing us for something or for being discriminated against or for whatever the particular case is. And there's no, part of the problem why we end up paying out is because we don't have good records of, we haven't documented the good, the bad, and the ugly. So how does, in this risk assessment, how do we go about focusing more on the employees as well as the evaluations of employees?
Mr. Bonner?
You covered most of it in great detail. I just had a couple brief questions. On attachment 3, where you break down by type of incident, traffic accidents are 22% of them. Are those city employees getting into accidents, or are those we had a tree branch blocking a stop sign, we'd been warned about it 17 times and we never did it, and therefore we're held responsible for the accident by one of the parties, or is it both?
It's both.
It's both?
Yes.
Okay. So if you look at traffic accidents, 22%, trip and fall, 6%, dangerous conditions, 12%, that's a significant portion, 40% right there, that is potentially infrastructure related. When you do your next phase, can you let us know, sort of in the same top 10 list, what type of infrastructure problems are the most troublesome? Obviously sidewalks, there's going to be things that we have not repaired that cause flooding, stuff like that. It'd be interesting to know by frequency of occurrence and by cost what those infrastructure issues are that continue to cause us to have liability. There's a lot of stuff that's training related, but then there's the infrastructure stuff as well. Then
I'm sorry, before you move off that, do you guys have the tools to be able to refine this data to that point yet? Because I know the city attorney until recently has really been lagging in their ability to do that, just because of they didn't have the databases and so on to do that. Could you do that if we were to ask you to do it? No?
I think it would be difficult. I mean, we just do our best.
Do the best you can, and then
Yeah.
this might be an area where it's like the next round. It's, risk management 2.0 or something after we get.
The reason I'm asking is I'm trying to think of what we can do in the next budget process.
Right.
There are things that we hear about here all the time that we may think about during the budget process as, oh, we need to think about this as a potential liability. But I'm wondering how through this process we can bake something in to the budget process so that certain budget requests are specifically flagged by the CAO as being something that will help us reduce our liability.
Sure.
And I was going to say that the motion that was introduced did talk about bringing the departments in to assess their own risk and liabilities, and I think that's an important piece of it. So they might have information that's more detailed and that can address your concerns, and so that would be an important step of this too, which is already addressed in the motion, is to bring the departments into this. So they're addressing it. They may have more information that we don't track, because we're tracking basically a claims and litigation database here. So
Does every department have someone assigned risk management as their responsibility for the department?
there should be, yes, sir.
And there are certain departments, sanitation comes to mind, where when there's a liability claim, there's a fund where a lot of the sanitation payouts come from, but most departments don't have that. So how do you sort of build in the departments having some skin in the game?
Well, I mean, that's been a subject matter that the CAO has kind of been contemplated over the years. Sanitation, for example, has special funds where if an occurrence occurs that is tied to that special fund is eligible to be tapped in to pay that on that issue. But most of the departments, it strictly comes out of the liability account, and which is managed by the city attorney, but it's really not, really there isn't a built-in incentive or disincentive for anybody to change behavior, because the payouts come from something that's not even in part of their budget. So we've been talking a little bit about how we can perhaps in this next budget cycle, allow, have everybody have some skin in the game, as you said, with regard to liabilities, whether that means allocating certain portions of the liability accounts to certain departments and holding them accountable to that level, if not less, or something to that effect. But it's something that we definitely want to try to address as soon as this next budget cycle and the development of the budget for 16-17.
I mean, it's a tough one because you want the GM and the department to have some skin in the game, but on the other hand, it's almost wrong to hold them responsible if it's at least one of the infrastructure stuff that I'm talking about, where it would be wrong to hold Gary Lee Moore accountable for some potential flooding in Playa del Rey or Venice, because we haven't put in the money over the years for the infrastructure to fix this stuff.
Yeah, it is, and those cases where it's a payout occurring for something that occurred maybe for the tenure of the current GM or his executive staff, it's very tough. That's why it's for all these years, it's probably just been a discussion point and never really been implemented. But perhaps we could try to pilot something as part of the next budget cycle tied to specific types of cases, more the employment related perhaps, or things of that nature.
Well, I'm glad to hear you talking about doing something in the next budget cycle.
And to that point too, Mr. Bond, one of the limitations of this data is that it's limited to the liability claims account, which is the general fund funded settlements. So it somewhat skews the data to all of those sanitation cases that get paid out of the SWRF, or DOT cases that get paid out of one of the DOT special funds. We're not able to see how that would affect the pie chart, for example. So, Mr. Kretz.
A question that might be a hair off topic. I know when I was in the legislature, I tripped over a couple companies, and don't ask me for their names 10 to 15 years later, but that were specialists in working with cities to reduce their workers' comp claims. And some of them had very significant track records in ability to drop those costs. Have we ever done a nationwide search to find one or two of those types of companies and worked with them to implement cost reductions in the city?
I do recall we have in the past. I remember we're looking at a DuPont model. I think I was one of them. DuPont did that years back. I think it was just the compensation involved. I mean, they wanted a certain amount of money, and the formula, it didn't quite make sense. I think economically for the city at that time. There are consultants out there that do good work and that type of thing. So there's certainly firms out there that do good work in this area. But I think that in all of this, to me, it's analytics and it's accountability. And that's not a lot of money. Good analytics and people being held accountable. And I think you'll get a lot of movement and traction that way with departments. So this is a good first step.
Okay, anything else, members? Then what I would propose, members, is that we advance the motion forward to council for approval. And then I'd also like to add to the motion a few of the things that we mentioned. First, Mr. Blumenfield mentioned comparative information from other cities. I certainly think that that's important, especially for comparison with other police departments, given the fact that police liability is half of our total liability, to the extent that other areas of large liability is available from other cities. I think it would be helpful to have that from the other major cities of the country as well as the best practices. To the extent that we can ascertain them, that would be very helpful in the next report back. And then I'd also like, since that conversation has already begun, I'd like a report with this from the CAO and the CLA on recommendations for potential changes to create greater accountability in liability payouts, whether it's distributing the liability claims account among departments or otherwise. Those are the sorts of policy recommendations. At least give us some options that we might be able to consider to make recommendations going forward. And Mr. Kretz had some suggestions about workers' comp that I think are worthy of a full motion by themselves. And so, Mr. Kretz, if we can, maybe
our offices can work on that.
Up and
that'd be great.
So that we don't slow this process up, because that's a whole nother big kettle of fish that we're going to have to get into next. Anything else I should add to that? Okay. That all clear?
I do have a suggestion for your motion. Your request city attorney's office to report back on those steps.
Yeah.
I would just say maybe add our office to work with the city attorney or vice versa.
By all means.
Sure.
You're encouraged to work with everyone on all things, so that would be fine. All right. If there's nothing further, that'll be the action of the committee. Thank you very much. Sure. Thanks for the good first step. Okay, that brings us to item number 5.
Item number 5 is the CA report relative to an overview of the city's debt capacity and consideration of various financing options for the city's capital equipment replacement program and various capital projects.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Natalie Brill, the City Administrative Officer. During the budget process, as well as in Council File 1383, you requested that we report back on the city's general fund debt capacity and the needs to use this capacity over the next 5 years. Currently, the 2015 and 16 debt capacity is 4.46% for the general fund, and overall our direct debt, which includes our general obligation bonds, is 6.68%. We met with departments that buy capital equipment, such as fire, police, and general services, and we looked at their replacement cycles and what they would need over the next 5 years. About 50% of the fleet needs to be replaced over the next 5 years, according to these three departments. We estimate, based on what they gave us, about $1 billion is needed to bring the city's fleet, fire, police, and GSD, excluding helicopters, up to a good replacement cycle every year. As well as looking at equipment, we also looked at real property. And one of the reasons we did that was because we know there are several large projects that are up there. And we found that we have about $1 billion in real property needs. Those would include the Convention Center, the Civic Center project on LA Street, and Taylor Yard at G2. We also realized that this fiscal year alone, there's additional $100 million that is needed in real property. And that includes 6th Street, the asphalt plant, a fire station, and the housing tenant improvements at Fig Plaza. So what we did is we looked overall at what was going on in the city's needs for debt. And we know that there are other ways of funding, of financing projects. And that's one of the reasons that, for example, for the Convention Center, we're looking at P3s and looking at what other alternative funding mechanisms we have. We also looked at mainly equipment. And the reason we tried to focus on equipment was because of the way that equipment is viewed by the market itself and how other cities and other municipal agencies look at equipment. Most cities use a mix of debt as well as pay-go. So we looked at various different options of what we could do, and we gave you 3 scenarios that we thought was a starting point to be able to look at as how you could fund equipment over the next 5 years. Basically, we're recommending that you allow us to go back and look at this more carefully. This was our first stab at doing this and looking at it very comprehensively. And then we're also requesting authority to go out to RFQ to look for a consultant to help us look at alternative funding options for major capital projects. So we feel this is really a beginning. We're also going to be looking at this as part of the MICLA budget request that comes in every year and looking at how to address this. And that's how this started last year, when we started seeing that our funding needs are growing exponentially compared to the amount of capacity that we had. So that's a quick overview of the report, and we're here to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay. So the idea is that we'd come back here next quarter with a more detailed report with some of these options and suggestions to go out to independent consultant to look at this as well. You have any questions at this point to this? Yeah, Mr. Blumenfield.
A couple questions.
Sure.
So how come, I see some of the 3 big departments, GSD, LAPD, Fire, how come ITA isn't in the report, considering they have the ITA infrastructure we have to replace is pretty large, or thinking specifically of our network?
One of the problems that we're having with ITA-type projects is a shift in the market away from ITA projects. They're just not as accepted anymore to debt finance. In the 90s, we financed computers. In the 2000s, we financed servers. We're not exactly sure where ITA is going in the sense of what the market and what bond council accept to use as capital. We have a normal infrastructure program. It's about $10 million in debt service a year, which is funded through commercial paper, which is about $100 million a year. And we got the impression that we could handle most of that through that. We did not, like I said, we did not speak to ITA because we weren't sure that what they were asking to fund was eligible for the type of leases that we do with MICLA. But we'll go back as part of this and we'll talk to ITA.
I think it makes sense to go back to look at that. I mean, I'm looking into the idea. I think we ought to have our virtual infrastructure fund as well as our physical infrastructure fund, especially as we move away from as you said, the big physical, and we're moving toward the cloud, and, when we're starting to make lease payments that are, they're more, it's just another way of folding in the financing in a different mechanism.
Yeah, physical infrastructure is fine. The virtual infrastructure is a real problem for a lease because there's nothing that you can really collateralize, which is the problem. But like I said, things change in the market. Opinions of the IRS and Bond Council change, so we will go back and look at ITA.
Okay. And then looking at other ways, when we're talking about debt financing, there's always those creative, a lot of these things that we're financing are creating a revenue stream of some sort, or creating a savings stream, if you will. And then how do we, when we can separate those projects out from just the regular projects that we have to finance for our own growth, that potentially opens up a whole new stream of capital. We can capitalize on the savings and then put that into the fund up front. I mean, it's something we don't do as much, but we probably could, and open up a large.
The 6% of the policy calls today for 6%, which is our general fund. If there's a revenue fund associated with it, it falls into the 7.5% category. We have very few of those. But most of those are general fund credits, meaning the general fund has to stand behind it because the market won't accept it. The best example of that is something like street lighting, where we use MICLA for the assessment fund, but it's backed by the general fund because the market won't accept just the revenue from the street lighting. I think it's called the Street Lighting Assessment Fund. So even though there's other revenue sources, it may still fall within the 6%.
And are there any other big departments besides ITA and the three you mentioned that we're looking at?
The only large department is sanitation, but we fund those through the solid waste fund. That's a different credit. We have wastewater, and that again is funded through a fee through a revenue fund, and that's truly an enterprise fund, so that has its own credit. So those are the other two that really make large purchases, but those are funded with a different credit, not the general fund.
Anything else on this number? Okay, then it'll be the action of the committee to approve the CAO's recommendations and request a report back in 120 days on further report back on financing and an RFI for consulting services. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That brings us to item number 9.
Item number 9 are reports from the CAO and the Board of Police Commissioners relative to a request for authority to contract, appropriate funds, accept U.S. Department of Justice grant funds, and travel to Arizona regarding the deployment of body-worn video cameras, conducted electrical weapons, and cellular phones by the Los Angeles Police Department.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Maggie Goodrich, CIO for the LAPD. I'm joined by Sergeant Dan Gomez.
Tyler Munhall, CAO.
Before you, you have the agreement with TASER for the purchase of 6,140 body cameras to complete the deployment of 7,000 cameras in total in the next year for all sworn officers who are in a uniformed enforcement or assignment. Before I get into those details and the costs associated with the program, I do have Sergeant Gomez here with the camera. I wasn't sure if anybody wanted to see a demo or have an explanation of how the camera works or anything like that before we get started. We're happy to do that.
Anybody interested?
I think most
That's
of you have
always
seen
fine.
it. I think most of you have seen it. But if there are questions, we have it here.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, even questions about that, like you can't erase it from your cell phone, right? Or how does that?
Correct.
You cannot. It's the cell phone is just a viewing device. All the data is stored on the camera that's on my chest, and then it's uploaded securely through the network into the cloud.
Okay.
But no, the officers have no
Let's not
access.
get sidetracked on that too much yet. Let's start with this contract.
No problem.
And then we're going to go into all that implementation
Okay.
stuff. But if you could start by kind of putting it into the larger context, the department's commitment to body cameras, the pilot program that was already approved that's been in place, and then let's move that forward as to how it is that we got from that point to where we are now with this contract that's in front of us, and then we'll come back to all those other kind of questions.
Sure. So by way of background, we started with a field test of the top 2 solutions that we identified in the market. And there were 30 officers in the Safer Cities Initiative here in the downtown area who tested those cameras from the 2 different solutions. The first was from Taser International, who was ultimately selected. The second was from a combination of vendors, Coban, which is the in-car video vendor for the police department, partnered with a camera company called Vivu, and that was the second solution that we tested. Each of the 30 officers tested both solutions for 90 days each, and provided us feedback on the use of that system. Also, Sergeant Gomez leads the tactical technology section that works in my bureau, Information Technology Bureau. They evaluate all new and emerging technology that would apply to the field. And so they also did very careful measured testing, making sure we were comparing apples to apples in terms of evaluating the technology, doing things like testing battery life, testing the camera in similar conditions, low light conditions, testing the audio, that type of thing, to really get a sense of both technologies. Ultimately, Taser was selected. Some of the primary reasons they were selected, one was battery life. Our officers work 12-hour shifts. We need a camera that will last at least 12 hours, and we did not want extra battery packs or swap out of batteries and things like that, peripheral equipment being required in order to get a camera to last an officer's entire shift. The other thing that made the Taser solution, the camera in particular, ideal was it also offers a 30-second pre-event buffer. And so what that means is that the camera is actually always recording a 30-second video loop while it's on. And then when an officer presses the record button, the camera actually grabs that last 30 seconds of video and then also activates audio as soon as that button's pushed. And so that way you always get the last 30 seconds before record was actually pressed. And that way, if an officer sees a violation in front of them, so for example, they see somebody run a stop sign, obviously they don't know the person's going to run a stop sign until they see it. So then when they press that button, it goes back and grabs the last 30 seconds of video, so you'll capture that violation on the video itself. So that was something that really distinguished the Taser solution, and it's something we have with in-car video today. In-car video actually offers a minute pre-event buffer. The other thing about the solution is that it's not just a camera. There are a lot of camera vendors out there, but this is a total solution. It includes evidence.com, which is a hosted storage solution, but in addition to being storage, it also provides a video management solution. So it allows for the upload of the video into the cloud, and then in the video management solution, that's what officers use to review their video, to tag their video, to indicate what happened in that video, add the CAD incident number, add information about that particular stop or arrest or whatever it may be. And then that solution tracks the chain of custody, holds the audit log anytime that video is viewed, shared, touched in any way. It's that information is captured so that we know who is watching each video and what's being done with it. The video is not able to be altered in any way. It's captured within the camera. The camera is a completely sealed device. The only way to transfer the video is to do it via evidence.com, get that uploaded. And then the other piece that is really helpful and proven helpful so far is that it allows for online sharing with the city attorney and district attorney. So right now with in-car video, we actually have to burn discs and drive those all over the city to file cases and present that evidence. With this solution, actually the CA and the city attorney and DA are able to have evidence.com accounts and be able to actually view the evidence that we share with them online. So we've eliminated that disc burning process. When we made the initial selection of Taser, the first 860 cameras were purchased by the Police Foundation and donated by the Police Foundation. And the Police Foundation actually agreed to pick up the first 2 years of costs on those cameras. So both the purchase of the camera and then all of the storage, support, maintenance, licensing, et cetera, for the first 2 years. When that first donation was made, the chief and also the mayor committed to having the police department deploy a total of 7,000 cameras to put cameras on every officer who's engaged in some sort of enforcement activity in the field. And the contract before you is to complete that purchase of 6,140 cameras, to complete the deployment of 7,000. The 860 that were donated by the Police Foundation were all rolled out between the end of August and early October or so. They've been in use for some time now. To date, we've captured over 100,000 videos just in the 3 divisions that received those first 860 cameras. And that number is growing quickly here. The contract that's before you is a 5-year agreement with TASER. And it includes a number of things. So it includes the camera itself, which we were able to negotiate a cost of less than 50% of the published pricing. It also includes all the storage, maintenance, licensing, video management software, sharing online, all of that functionality at about 25% off their list price. It also includes upgraded cameras over the life of the 5-year contract twice. So at year 2.5 and year 5 of the agreement, we'll actually get 7,000 replacement cameras. And that's really to keep up with how quickly this technology is moving. The technology is advancing very rapidly, and so what we don't want to do is deploy these and then have to come back and look for new cameras a couple of years from now. So we'll replace the total 7,000 cameras at year 2.5 and year 5. The other thing that the agreement includes is 4,400 actual TASER devices, so the conductive electrical weapons, 4,400 of those, and that will complete the distribution of one TASER to every officer in the field. We already have a little over 3,000, so that will complete that deployment. And then finally, it also includes a mobile phone or a smartphone with each camera. The smartphone is used to pair with the camera so that an officer can actually see on the smartphone what the camera is actually pointed at and what it's capturing. It also allows the officer in the field, without having to go back to the station, update their video so they can add that metadata to their video in the field. So after an officer's recorded a video, they can pull it up on that smartphone, view the video, and then tag it. They can add the CAD incident number, add details about that particular stop or arrest or whatever it may be, and that eliminates the need to actually have to go back to the station to do that type of activity. It also makes the video, searching for that video much easier the more information they tag on there. The idea down the line is to take advantage of the fact that we're deploying mobile devices to the officers and really deploy a whole connected officer program. So we'll be working on a number of mobile apps to collect data in the field, to get rid of paper processes and make our officers much more mobile, able to stay out in the community that much longer. So for example, a couple of the mobile applications we're talking about deploying, one would be recently the state legislature came down with some new requirements for data that we collect as it pertains to stops. So the stops data that will be collected today, officers typically have to go back to the station to input data about the stops that they've made throughout the day. In this instance, they'll have a mobile app that will enable them to do that. Today, officers who have a mobile data computer in their vehicle can do things like run criminal history checks and the like. We can't do that if you're an officer, say, on a bicycle or horseback or on a motorcycle that doesn't have a computer at your hands. That requires communication back and forth with our communications division. So enabling those type of activities from the mobile device will be very important. The year one costs here that are listed in the report not only cover the cameras and the smartphones, but also some security applications needed for the smartphones in order to do those criminal history runs that I mentioned, and then also some infrastructure work.
I'm sorry, excuse me. There's a disruption in the back of the meeting. Is there a sergeant who could show this gentleman the door for disrupting the meeting?
No seconds.
You'll be silent for the rest of the meeting or you'll leave. We clear?
Pardon?
You'll be silent for the rest of the meeting or you will be shown the door.
Who are you addressing it to, sir?
You.
Who's you?
One more word, you're gone. Go ahead.
The additional costs are for infrastructure work that's required in year one. So there's funding here for ITA and general services. Each camera, when the officer comes back to the station, is dropped into a docking station in order to do that automatic upload to the cloud storage. It also charges the battery on the camera and updates date and time, updates any software or firmware upgrades on those cameras. So there are costs involved in GSD installing any power requirements in some of the stations, and also ITA to install the network switches to connect those docking stations to the network and ultimately out to the internet. I think I covered everything. Tyler, did I miss anything?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing I should mention is that included in the request here is also the request to accept grant funding. So we were fortunate enough to receive the top award actually from DOJ in terms of the grant funding that was made available for the purchase of body cameras. So there were 6 agencies across the country that received $1 million, and we were one of them. So about 700 of these cameras will be purchased with that grant funding.
The final thing I'd add is that as far as funding for this year, there's $4.5 million in the unappropriated balance for this purpose. The department identified approximately $2 million in savings that they'll be able to use this year for this purpose, and then an additional.
What was that? Say that last part again.
There's approximately $2 million in savings that the department has identified, and that's essentially so we don't have to go to the reserve fund. And then there's an appropriation of $479,000 from the forfeited asset trust fund for a total of the $8 million for 15-16.
All right. Mr. Blumenfield, do you want to start? All right. I'm sorry. Mr. Herman, you're going to have to leave the room. You're out, Mr. Herman. You're out of the room. Go. You're out of the room. For disrupting the meeting. Leave now.
My phone rang.
Leave now. I'm not giving you a choice in this. I'm telling you, leave the room.
So technically you're saying that because my phone accidentally rang.
Get out of the room. You're disrupting the meeting.
That's not just.
And because you came in bleeding like a goat, we know you're trying to disrupt the meeting.
You're done. You're continuing to disrupt the meeting as I'm speaking now. Leave the room.
Budget full. That's my last comment to. Nasty over here.
Mr. Blumenfield, did you have some questions?
Yes, thank you. On what we're doing here, I see the report mentions we're talking about 122 positions needed to support the patrol video unit ultimately to make all of this happen. And so I'm trying to figure out what that's all for, although we're not obviously authorizing those positions right now. By accepting this contract, we're getting ourselves down the road. It's going to be very difficult to not do those positions down the road. So I think we need to think about those and understand what those positions are for. It seems, not knowing all the details, that number, I got a little sticker shock when I saw that number of 122 new full-time equivalent positions, especially that a lot of them are sworn, and you're talking about basically technical backup, of which I would imagine a lot of this has to do with, and this is where it comes back to the contract. How much of this is for the contractor to do, and the typical stuff that we're contracting out, which is why we're giving a big contract, and what is it that we're signing ourselves up to do as a city and as a police department with all of these new potential hires, and where are they going to come from?
Sure.
A lot of questions in one.
So the positions that are mentioned in the report are not being requested this time. That's our best estimate of what may be needed as this deployment rolls out. And it's also in light of the fact that we'll, at the end of this year, have also deployed in-car video throughout the entire department. We only have half of the department up and running now. So it's really with the thought of 7,000 body cameras, and a full department deployment of in-car video. So the positions will do a few things, and I'll explain why they're primarily sworn as well. The most of the work on the technical side, you're absolutely correct, will be handled by the vendor. That's part of going with a hosted solution, is that the vendor will be providing the technical support for the system. Any other technical pieces that are required are primarily around just the management and maintenance of the smartphones themselves. So the management of a mobile device management solution to ensure that we properly manage the use of those smartphones. So we can do things, for example, like if an officer loses their phone, we can remotely wipe that phone, wipe any data off of that phone without having to have it in our hands. We'll be able to control security and those type of things. All of that is being handled by civilian technical staff. The sworn positions that we're talking about will handle a number of other things. So, for example, first and foremost, there is just the regular requirements of reviewing video as it pertains to administrative investigations. Every time there's an officer-involved shooting, a use of force, a pursuit, complaint against an officer that Internal Affairs has to handle, there is a review of video that is going to expand quite a bit. If you think of the average call where a couple of cars come up, a number of officers arrive on scene, not only are we talking about in-car video in each of those vehicles, but now every officer that arrives on scene will have that body camera as well. So there's quite a bit of review there. Some of the other positions will be actually to build out a...
But just on the review point, right now, if there's a situation, there's already an officer and a team that reviews that situation. I mean, I would imagine having the videos could make it easier and make it, ideally, is going to save time. I don't see why it's costing us more time.
We'll see how it impacts us, and that's part of the reason those positions aren't being asked here today. Some of it may save us time, some of it may extend the time because of the number of videos that have to be watched. If you think of an incident that's maybe 30 minutes long, if you have 6 body cameras and 2 or 3 vehicles, that could be quite a bit of footage to watch, but we'll see how that goes and what's really required there and how it really impacts investigations. You're absolutely right. For example, in the investigation of personnel complaints, many of those complaints that typically would be a not resolved, sort of he said, she said type situation, now we'll have that video and very quickly be able to determine what happened. And so it should speed that type of review up. There are some other things that come...
Where you're trying to figure out which way the car came from and you send out people to go do the investigation. All of that seems like it would be cut way down by having, that's the goal here, by having the camera.
Absolutely, absolutely. The other positions will be needed to do a few other things. So one is there is an inspection process that's required anytime we deploy something new with a new policy. So one of the things that will be required, we can't obviously watch every video that's captured. Like I said, we've already captured 100,000 videos to date in just 3 divisions, but each division will be required to have a couple individuals assigned to reviewing video that may not necessarily be associated with a use of force or a complaint against an officer, but to review video to ensure officers are complying with the policy that requires that officers activate that camera prior to initiating contact with a community member and that they leave the camera on throughout the entire public contact. So today with in-car video, we do regular inspections of video to ensure officers are complying with that policy. And really the only way to do that today is to pick a random sampling of video and watch that video to ensure compliance with the policy. We are actually working with a number of innovators in the technology space to hopefully down the line be able to enable things like machine learning to help us actually do some of those reviews and analyses of video in an automated fashion so that it won't always require a human being sitting at a computer watching video, but that is the reality of ensuring that we deploy this in a sort of thoughtful and accountable manner. To us, it's not just enough to deploy the cameras and assume the program is working, but we really want individuals ensuring that they're being used properly. And then the other thing is we're going to need a section to expand on Sergeant Gomez's role, basically, to do all of the training and deployment of the cameras themselves, but then ultimately to serve as subject matter experts on the use of the cameras. So today, Sergeant Gomez is really one of the only staff members that I have that appears in court as a subject matter expert on the system, that testifies in Board of Rights whenever a personnel complaint rises to that level of an administrative hearing into an officer's conduct. And the reason that that type of position is sworn and not civilian is that while some of what the sergeant can speak to is the technical operation of the system, much of it pertains to policy, operations, and sort of sequencing of how we train the officers and what their role is as it pertains to not only the camera itself, but how they deploy that camera in light of the scenario around them, tactics considerations, public safety considerations, and the like. So there are a number of sort of different roles that went into the thought process of coming up with that estimate on positions.
I guess we'll look at those further. As mentioned, I got that sticker shock coming in, but I love the connected police officer program. I mean, I love the idea of the cameras and where that's going to take us and being connected. I also want to see what you were talking about, which is starting to move us more toward fully being connected, not just for some of the things you were talking about, but for taking basic police reports. You know, we still have officers in the field that are, you know, when they're filing a report, they're getting the paper out, the pencil out. I've had officers complain about that. Yeah. Is it safe to assume that this technology, even though it's video-based and you can do some of these things, will also enhance our ability to do virtual reports, you know, basic police reports?
So it depends on which reports we're talking about. So some of the things we are looking at being able to enable right here from the mobile device. So for example, the field interview card. Today, every time an officer has a public encounter, they fill out that field interviewer FI card, literally a note card with a pen or pencil. And that gets sent off to the station, and records clerk or you know, somebody in the station will input that into the FI system. So one of our initial goals is to develop an electronic FI so that can all be done from the field. It will eliminate some of the data entry redundancies, eliminate errors in data entry by being able to scan or take a photo of a driver's license, pull in that information through optical character recognition, and save some time in that way, and also make the data immediately then available to others in the department or to the officer, any pertinent information that the officer may need to know while making that particular stop. There are other more, I would say, complex reports that are going to require some other infrastructure upgrades within the police department. You'll actually see that request as part of the 16-17 budget process. So in order to get to a place where we truly have field reporting in terms of arrest reports and crime reports and bookings and things like that, we're actually going to need a new records management system to be able to handle that. Because today, while we could develop a mobile app that would allow you to complete that report, we don't have the infrastructure and back end in place in order to receive the data from a modern technology like that. The FI database is one of the modern, more recently built systems, but the records management system as a whole that holds the crime and arrest data is an 30-year-old mainframe application. And so until we procure a proper records management system, a commercial off-the-shelf product that's built to do that in a modern technology, some of that field reporting will not be able to handle.
But the two can be interoperable?
Correct. Yes.
That's the other, we don't want to create these two independent systems that can't talk to each other.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the approach going forward for any technology we implement is always with the thought that we're going to be procuring that modern records management system very, very shortly, hopefully. And any technology we're deploying along the way must be interoperable with that.
One more word on the police department, getting all these people, and I'll just put the pin in it now, is I'm worried that whenever we do an increase like this, it always ends up coming from the West Valley and other parts of the city, like what happened with the Metro Division, that theoretically doesn't impact the service in those areas, but in actuality, we find that it does. So I don't know where these 122 folks are going to come from. Do we know? Or just they're all new?
I can't speak to that at this moment. We'll have to sort of go through the budget exercise. I can tell you that we are considering looking at things like, while we do believe it needs to be sworn officers, light duty officers or officers who may have a restriction and be restricted to maybe a desk assignment, can't be in the field at the moment, certainly could still be reviewing video, that type of thing. So maybe we won't have to ask for as many
And that wasn't a
positions.
fair question for you. That was just to kind of put a pin in that one. One last issue, the evidence.com storage data, we're already using that, right?
Correct.
And tell us about how their cybersecurity measures and whether or not there's something we need to do further along those lines.
Sure. So we've reviewed their security extensively. Everything that's recorded on that camera is encrypted, 256-bit encryption. It's encrypted also in transit as it's being uploaded to evidence.com, and then it's also encrypted at rest in the cloud-hosted storage solution. We've done a review as it compares to CJIS requirements, Criminal Justice Information Systems security requirements. That CJIS requirements typically apply to data that involves criminal history data from state or DOJ databases. So while this video does not necessarily require CJIS security compliance, we measured it against that anyway as sort of the gold standard, and it meets that requirement. And so we are comfortable that we've chosen a solution that certainly meets the highest mark in terms of cybersecurity. And part of the reason I am partial to going with this hosted solution is that the companies, it's in the company's best interest to keep up with the latest security needs, to keep up with the latest technologies, and to always be on top of that. They have some real expertise in that area. They've also partnered very heavily with Microsoft to understand from the Microsoft side, experts in cybersecurity areas. And so I'm confident that while it's true probably anything can be hacked, we can't always say with 100% we won't be. They've done everything they certainly can to protect it.
And we upload it through cellular?
We actually upload connected through the network, so we use the city's fiber ring to connect out to the internet through our ISP and up to the internet. The other thing I should mention, I apologize, is you raised the point of how it's going to impact investigations. Separate and apart from this, we also have grant funding from the National Institute of Justice, which is the research arm of DOJ. And we received an initial award of $1 million, and we were recently notified that we're going to receive an additional $1 million to study the impact of these cameras on the department. We're partnering with a private research firm, also in conjunction with professors from UCLA and George Mason University, who are doing ride-alongs actually before we deploy the cameras and then at various points throughout the deployment of these cameras. And they will be specifically studying the impact of the cameras on the department, on the city, on the police officer, and the community member, how it impacts those interactions. They'll be looking at things like uses of force and complaints and claims against the city. So we will certainly also report back regularly on those results. And those reports will come out periodically and be made available.
Thank you. Thank you for your work on this. This is a program I'm very strongly supportive of, and I'm glad to see us moving forward on it. Although, I got to say, Mr. Blumenfield pointed out something that totally freaked me out. I had caught the 6 positions for this year. I didn't catch that next paragraph on the next page about the 122 positions. That scares the heck out of me for the same reasons that Mr. Blumenfield articulated. Just the thought of having 1 or 2 folks at Pacific reviewing tapes, I can't get folks to answer the 1-877 number at LAPD. My constituents can't get non-emergency calls picked up. The 122 positions really scares me. What happens if? And I'm afraid that this action locks us into that. So, what happens if we approve this? We approve the 6 positions, and then in the next budget year, we don't approve the 122. Have we just blown $31 million?
I don't think we've blown $31 million because we still have 7,000 cameras on police officers capturing their public contacts. I think, those are policy decisions in terms of, do they need to be sworn or civilian? Can we use reserve or light duty? Do they have to be full duty? And, are there other ways to go about that? And then there are also decisions to be made. Like I said, a lot of those positions that we contemplated would be for regular inspections of video outside of the use of force investigation or the complaint process. And so there will be some policy decisions to be made about how we go about doing that. And so I think that's why, while we've given a best estimate, we haven't committed to anything at this point in terms of the need.
And Councilmember, just to add, there are definitely deployment impacts that will occur, whether the 122 positions are new positions to the budget or just, positions that are taken from the field to staff this unit. But there's also, budgetary impacts that haven't been calculated as part of the report. For 122 positions, we're talking about a range from $10 to $12 million per year for those positions.
Yeah, I mean, either way, it's a big hit. Honestly, before I vote on this in council, this is council Wednesday. I'd like
Wednesday.
I'd like to hear from the chief. I think the chief needs to explain in a letter or in testimony to us what his intention is for the 122 positions. I think it's too big a leap for me to make without knowing a little bit more on how the chief intends to do this. I've been very concerned about the redeployment of Metro and the impact on services in my area, just as Mr. Blumenfield has in the West Valley. And if he's not going to take it from patrol and he's going to be asking us in the next year to add 122 new cops, I think that's something we need to know before we take this leap. So I just request that the chief share some info with us before Wednesday on that. I'm looking at Harry on that one, not at you, don't worry.
And on that point, too, just because both of you have mentioned it, I will also signal that I'm going to expect to see that the greatest number of those positions possible be civilian positions, that the cost of those positions be, I just can't imagine how 120 sworn are necessary for this. I just can't. Maybe it is, but I'll want to see real clear workforce indicators that suggest that number is appropriate and that they need to be sworn, because right now I'm not seeing it. And if those or any portion of those 120 are coming out of patrol, I think you're going to have an unhappy council.
Yeah.
So I would just suggest that not be the case,
Right.
because it will not pass.
Right. So
I'm sorry,
I
Mr. Blunt,
had a
you
couple
were
more, thanks. So Mr. Seha was just saying that if it were 122 new cops, it would be 12 to 14 million or something?
Between 10 to 12.
10 to 12.
Per year.
We'd also, in the next fiscal year, I understand the mayor or the council will need to identify another 4.8 million for the contract. Is that true? Next fiscal year, it's a $10.3 million cost, and we still have to identify 4.8 million of that?
It'll be, next year is $14.69 million for the whole project.
Okay.
$9.49 million for TASER.
And how much of that is money we're going to need to come up with in the budget?
All of it.
All of it.
All of it. Okay.
They may be getting a new grant, so the grant would reduce that by whatever amount the grant turns out to be.
And we don't know what that might be until we get it?
Correct.
Okay. So the smartphones, is that an additional cost? Do we have to buy the smartphones as well, or is that included in this 31 million?
It's included in the overall price of the program. It's not included in the 31 million with TASER. We actually procured the smartphones directly through Sprint rather than through TASER so that we could recognize a cost savings there. TASER was not able to offer them to us at much of a discount, where Sprint was able to discount them significantly.
So we have to buy 7,000 new phones.
Correct, and that's included in the budget there.
That's included in the budget.
Yes.
What about the cell phone contracts?
That's included in the budget as well.
That's included as well. Okay. I had a question on the replacement cycle. Taser's offering 2 normal replacement cycles as part of the 5-year contract?
Correct.
But the replacement cycle is 5 years, right?
The replacement cycle is every 2.5 years. So we'll get 7,000 replacement cameras at year 2.5 in the contract, and then at year 5.
Okay. So that means over the course of the contract, we'll be getting 14,000 cameras. 7,000, and then at 2.5 years.
3 times, actually, 21.
Three times. So
21,000.
21,000. Okay. And the phones, or do we anticipate those are going to have to be replaced at a similar clip?
Those should last us a little longer typically than the 2.5 years.
But with technology, I mean, it'll get outdated pretty quickly. I mean,
Yes, and normally, we're using our existing Sprint contract for all the other phones that we procure for the department. Typically, Sprint offers us significantly reduced upgrade plans. When we continue the monthly coverage, we usually get replacement phones at very little cost.
and the term of the contract is 5 years with an option for an additional 5-year extension?
Correct.
Don't we usually do 1-year extensions on city contracts?
It depends on the contract. Sometimes we do 1, sometimes we do 2 or 3. In this instance, we included a 5-year option. That doesn't necessarily have to be exercised at the time. The reason we did that is because currently the way Taser's offering their pricing, they are able to lock in pricing 5 years at a time. And so if they offer that 5 years from now, the thought would be that we may want to take advantage of that, and that's why we included a 5-year option. If we don't at the time, we can certainly extend for less than that.
We could do a 1-year or a
Correct.
2-year or something like that.
Councilman, just to be totally clear and upfront, you were talking about things that are in the budget and not in the budget.
Yeah.
The budget we're talking about is attachment E, which is the last page of the report, not the adopted budget. In the adopted budget, there's $4.55 million in the unappropriated balance.
Right.
And the savings that the department has identified in its expense accounts. So there's a budget for the project, and then there's the adopted budget. I just want to make clear we're talking about the right budget.
Okay, all right. And assuming we approve this, council approves this, when are things operational, functional with all 7,000?
We plan to start deploying in the second week of January, and deployment will be complete by November of 2016.
So about 10, 11 months?
Correct.
Okay. And do you know where they're going to be rolled out first? I mean, do you have a sense of, is it going to start geographically?
So we've actually put the stations in order of complexity of the infrastructure installs. So there are certain stations where the infrastructure work is very quick, primarily because the station's relatively new and can handle the power and networking requirements. What you'll see is at the end of the list are really the older stations or the stations where there's some complexity in terms of the installation of that infrastructure.
Okay, now for real, my final question. I thought that was going to be my final question, but the way you answered that made me think. You and I worked together to get the cameras at Venice Beach, which are being installed now. Hopefully will be turned on very, very shortly. As we went about that, we discovered sort of hidden infrastructure costs of getting it hooked up to Pacific Area Police Station and stuff like that. Have we taken care of those types of costs in what we've budgeted so far, or are we going to, once we start going out to the stations, are we going to be like every infrastructure project in downtown Los Angeles that discovers something unusual?
So we did site walks 3 times in preparation of this budget, in preparation of all the quotes and estimates for the cost of that infrastructure work. And one of the reasons is that very reason that you just described, making sure that we're not finding any hidden costs, that general services and ITA and any subcontractors to them are considering those types of costs. So we are confident that we've captured everything that we can be aware of. So far, the infrastructure work in the first 3 stations, we were able to get that right on. There weren't change orders or anything.
Do we have a contingency or anything for that in the budget we have adopted? No?
No. And Councilman, attachment D, which is the second to last page of the report, has the schedule of stations, how it'll be rolled out.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, I think I would start by saying exactly what my colleague said. We're all in the same situation. We all represent districts that are a little lower in violent crime that have seen a fairly dramatic drop-off in service. So I don't know that any of us are anxious to lose more officers on the street. So I'd say, first of all, I would hope that to the extent you need sworn that you use light duty and reserves and civilians. Reserves sound the best to me, since they don't cost us anything other than training. I think also it's not clear to me whether if you have 10 officers responding to a situation that you need to check all 10 officers' videos and all 10 of their cars. At some point, you probably get a full picture. So I don't know if are we required to pay to look at every second of each of 20 different angles showing the same thing? Or do we have the ability to get the information we need and not look at every minute of every single camera?
So that's determined on a case-by-case basis, depending on the incident and what occurred during that incident. That's something that we're working through right now, actually, with the city attorney and district attorney as well, in terms of what needs to be reviewed before it's produced for them. So as we learn from the 860, I think we'll better understand that. But certainly, in an investigation, we do want to make sure we're reviewing all of the relevant evidence.
And you mentioned that we'd be looking at a lot of things beyond use of force and the things that are absolutely necessary to look at. What other kinds of things would we be looking at?
So that's more of that inspection piece that I talked about in terms of ensuring officers are complying with the policy. So meaning that they're activating the camera in a timely manner and deactivating the camera only after the incident and the public contact has concluded. And that's most of that other review that I talked about.
How much of that other review are we anticipating the total workload to be?
I'm not sure that we can predict that at this time. That's part of what we'll be analyzing.
So it seems like something that would be pretty non-essential except for an occasional, very sporadic check just to make sure that there wasn't widespread misuse of it. I think I probably reacted the same way everyone else did to the 122. I think that strikes me as much too much staff, and I would hope we'd be looking at something considerably smaller. Also, just for the record, how did we justify our not implementing the Arizona policy on this particular contract?
Councilman, the Arizona policy recommends that wherever possible, if it is economically feasible and within the law, that we not contract with companies in Arizona. In this case, the federal government, we're getting grant funds from them, and the federal government forbids that a geographical exclusion be applied when using federal funds. So it is infeasible to follow that recommendation of the council.
Fair enough. Thank you.
And also, we can waive that policy whenever we choose to. We've done it many, many times, and that's one of the
Right,
requests.
but a question
before us
whether
to
we
get to
should, and that's really the answer.
All right. I've got quite a few questions, but before I do, I also want to echo my colleagues. Seems like broad support for the concept of the direction that we're going in with body cameras. I think this is, I told the chief the other day, I think this is going to be a nation-leading experience that LAPD is going to have. And if we do this in the way we all hope that it can be done, I think it can really be a model for the country. Extremely important policy, and I think the outcome of it will be not only significantly greater relationship of trust between the public and the police department, but a different perspective on police work by the public as well. And I think we're going to see a lot more examples of the job being done right instead of the YouTube videos that we get now of the job not being done right. And so I think it's a very, very important step forward, and I think I applaud the mayor for his leadership in pushing this. So that's what makes me a little torn with this, because I am wholly supportive of the policy. but I have to say that I feel a bit set upon by having to, address all of these questions in a $50+ million contract in a very short amount of time, if you'll excuse the expression, kind of under the gun, with only 2 council meetings left in the year. And I just need to say I'm not happy with the process that got us to this position. And I think we should probably start by talking about this Kern County bidding process and how we're riding on that. Why is that? Why did we choose that route rather than just putting out an RFP of our own as, one of the biggest departments in the country? Why are we being led by Kern County?
So we actually started the competitive evaluation well before Kern County even released their RFP, and that was through that field test that I mentioned that happened actually a couple years before Kern County released their RFP. We did an analysis of the market and narrowed it down to the 2 solutions that could provide the total solution. And keep in mind, while there are dozens, if not probably hundreds, of vendors out there that make a camera, we could find very few that actually provided a total solution to be able to track the chain of custody of video, those audit logs, and be able to produce evidence for court, for criminal prosecutions. So we did select TASER through that competitive evaluation. The initial purchase was done by the Police Foundation, and therefore we did not release a formal RFP, but we did do the competitive evaluation. The decision to write on the Kern County RFP is one that we make quite often in the city. We do piggyback on other jurisdictions' procurements, and typically if we see another jurisdiction that did engage in a competitive bid process and their specifications matched our specifications, we will utilize that, quite frankly, to save time and resources. The process here in the city, on average, from the date the RFP is released to the date of a contract execution, is well over 1 year. And so we would have been here for some time going through an RFP process should we have decided to go down that road. What we found was that Kern County in just May of this year issued an RFP that matched almost exactly our specifications that we would have released in an RFP. And so it's very common practice in the city. A number of departments, both LAPD, GSD, ITA, others, will identify another jurisdiction's either RFP or contract to write on and use that selection process. Kern County did an open bid process. They did have multiple vendors respond. They evaluated all of the vendors against that criteria. They had vendor demos, and in the end awarded to the agreement to TASER, and made the selection of TASER for primarily the same reasons that we made the selection of TASER, as I spoke about that battery life and that buffer and having the total solution, chain of custody, et cetera. It was really, they came to the same decision that we had come to through our competitive evaluation.
So they did have multiple bidders?
Yes.
Okay. And did you have an opportunity to review all of their evaluative documentation of those bidders as well, so you could have the benefit of that comparison as well?
We were not able to review all of their documentation, but we were able to have conversations with them about their process and their selection.
And do you know whether they have the same, whether their process includes all of the standard city provisions that have been enacted in this city for RFP processes?
So those city standard provisions get attached to our contract.
Right.
So they're not necessarily tied to the RFP itself. So while their city standard provisions don't necessarily mirror our standard provisions, when we enter into the contract, our standard provisions get attached to the contract. So there's no getting around those city standard provisions. They always go with the contract, even if they weren't applicable to the other jurisdiction's RFP. And they are attached here to the TASER agreement.
The city attorney did also approve the piggybacking.
Okay. So the goal is, or this contract will achieve 7,000 personnel who will be equipped with body cameras.
Correct.
And I guess I'd kind of like to define who's included within that and who is not included within that. So, for example, how many officers right now are assigned to traffic? How many are assigned to patrol? I'm sure it's not 7,000 if you take the total of those. So who's included within that?
You want to give the rundown?
Sure. So what we did is we looked at all uniformed assignments that have some enforcement activity within the organization, lieutenants and below. So that did include all the traffic officers, gang officers, specialized units like Metropolitan Division, SWAT, all the patrol officers, juvenile division. I mean, the list goes on and on. We also looked at having a percentage of spares at each one of the divisions. So as a requirement, the officers have to have a camera in order to go out in the field. So each division will have a small percentage of spares at the division. So if there is a break, they can still replace it, go out into the field. So that's included in that number. Okay. In addition, there's a small amount set aside for investigative work. For instance, if a detective's at a particular division have to serve a search warrant and they're going to be in some sort of uniform, they can check it out. But as part of their regular duty, they don't wear a uniform, so it would make not good business practice to have it for them. But there is a good amount to have it set aside so that if they do engage in that kind of activity, or we have a major event in the city, we're accounting for those as well.
Okay. And did I understand, this is a little operational, maybe it's off the topic of this committee, but just I guess I wasn't clear that it actually has to be activated by the officer. How do you deal with a situation where maybe the officer thinks that in that prior 30 seconds or maybe even a more extended period there was something that the officer didn't want to be reviewed, and so the choice is made not to activate it? I mean, isn't part of the point of this to create that kind of accountability that we don't necessarily want to leave in the hands of the individual officer?
So we are looking at technology that will allow for the automatic activation of the cameras that doesn't quite exist in a sort of deployment-ready state today. Today, what we do require is that if an officer is not able to activate in a timely manner, they actually have to document why they were unable to activate it in a timely manner. So if they do not activate for some time into an event, they have to be able to articulate in writing why they were unable to activate that camera. Certainly, Dan can speak to the training in terms of how we train to make sure we think tactics and safety first. So if someone's pointing a gun at you, you're probably going to deal with that situation before activating the camera, but we train that you have to activate as soon as you can. And if it is late, you have to be able to articulate that. We are looking at some technology advancements that would allow for an auto activation based on certain events. We're looking at things like potentially if you were to unholster your gun, for example, a Bluetooth connection that would activate that camera, that type of thing. So there are some advances in technology, I think, coming actually relatively quickly that we'll see probably as part of this deployment, but those are still being tested.
Okay. Since you mentioned unholstering the gun, did I also hear you to say that part of this contract will include additional tasers being provided to the department? Taser,
Correct.
You mean the taser weapon?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
How many?
4,400, which will complete the deployment of a taser for each officer in the field.
Okay. And is that included in the 24 million component of this? There was
Yes.
30 some for the contract, and then there was the 24 for the phones.
It's included in the 30-some for the contract.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Yes.
All right.
And that includes the 5-year extended warranty on those as well.
Okay. Now, on the phones, $24 million divided by 7,000 comes to over $3,000 per officer. So how is it where's that money being spent? That's a lot for phones and plans, especially if we have a 2-year replacement cycle.
So the phones themselves retail for $500 to $600. We're paying less than $200 for them, including taxes up front. And then it's the data and the voice plan monthly on each of those phones to keep them connected. It also includes quite a bit of development time. So Sprint has brought a development partner in that is actually helping us stand up an LAPD app world. So just like you have the App Store on the Google Play Store, the Apple App Store, we will actually stand up an LAPD app store that will house all of the apps specific for our officers. And it includes the development of a number of apps. So included in that is the development and deployment of the electronic FI card that I spoke about, creating that security around being able to do criminal history runs from the device, and also collecting stops data in the field. So there's quite a bit included in that.
Okay. Now, I heard two different numbers on current departmental savings that might be applied to this. In attachment E, it says $1.5 million, and I thought I heard you say around two plus million.
I added those together. So there's $1.5 million in current year savings, and then there's $500,000 in 14-15 contractual services savings that they're going to deobligate and then reappropriate.
Okay. So given that the department had a shortfall as early as the last FSR, as recently as the last FSR, how are we finding $2 million in savings when we needed a mid-year adjustment under the FSR?
We didn't do a mid-year adjustment. We reported a deficit initially of $5.3 million in the sworn account, and that's gone down to about $3.3 million, and that's still there in the sworn account. However, it's fully offset by savings in other accounts, including civilian salaries. Within the $1.5 million in savings, most of that is in expense accounts. There's $303,000 that they're going to absorb, that's salaries, but in a $1.4 billion budget, $303,000 is not very much. So the rest of it is coming from expense accounts.
Okay. So none of that money could be applied to sworn salary account anyway, or would take a separate action to do that?
We've already solved that.
Yeah.
We will solve that in the mid-year.
Okay. Some portion of our patrol, some portion of our sworn personnel already are assigned to cars with the mobile data computer devices in the cars, right?
Correct.
So as to at least that portion of the force, do the phones add any data utility that isn't already provided by what is in the cars already?
Quite a bit. So, for example, that electronic FI card that I spoke about to get rid of that paper and data entry, we're developing a mobile app that will allow for that data entry from the field and automatic scanning via the mobile device of a driver's license to capture that information to hopefully reduce errors in data entry, that type of thing, will not be available on the mobile data computer, but will be possible with a mobile device in your hand.
If I could add one other example to that, is one of the other applications that we're working on is each of the phones have a camera on it. So we're working on security around that and operational requirements so that when the officers are in the field, they can use their cell phone to take a photo of a scene, upload that directly into the cloud so it's secure, nothing's left on the phone itself. And today the process is that the officers radio back to the station and have another officer drive a camera to their location and hope that that camera is charged, that there's enough memory in it. They take it back to the station, upload it into a centralized system back at the station. Now having a phone in their hand, they'll be able to do this directly in the field. It's actually one of the items that's most exciting for the officers because it eliminates that waiting process.
Okay. There's a termination for convenience clause in the contract.
Correct.
I'm going to assume, but I want you to clarify for me that that would be exercised by the city council and the mayor if it were to be exercised. This wouldn't be something that would be discretionary within the department, I assume.
I believe that requires city council action to terminate a contract.
Okay. And what would the circumstances be that would not be a breach of contract?
So, for example, if the city decided it was going to maybe build its own cloud and we wanted to store the data, maybe we'd want to transfer the data to our own storage solution, something like that. That certainly is within our purview.
Would there be any penalties in doing that? If
No.
we were to terminate forgiveness?
No, as long as we provide 30 days written notice of the termination.
Okay. As I'm checking my notes, did anybody else want to jump in, or are you guys good? Okay. Is there any, I'm sorry, this is an area that I shouldn't even venture into. I should leave to Mr. Blumenfield, who actually has an expertise in this area, and probably Mr. Bonin as well. Mr. Kretz and myself, not so much. But
I have a feeling it's technical.
But an obvious concern that will be raised by the public is there any way that video, for example, that is obtained in the field can be edited in the field or altered in any way? Is there any way that that's even feasible, that an officer, him or herself, or a supervisor or otherwise can edit or alter this video in any way?
No. Do you want to explain the technology a little bit?
I'll give you the best non-techie answer to a techie question. So the video itself is comprised of a bunch of ones and zeros. That's what it comes down to. When the video is recorded, it's very unique to that one video. Any alteration to that video would change those ones and zeros, and the device itself does a check on each one of those videos in sections to make sure it's never altered. So one is the officers don't have the ability to access the video in terms of those kind of changes, and if it did, the system itself would flag that it's been changed, and it would notify the system administrators, but the officers don't even have access to that level of detail within the video itself. So, and that's also how we ensure chain of custody. So when we go take the video from the device through the upload into evidence.com and then to court, we're able to prove that it never changed through the entire process, so it's admissible in court.
Okay, great. In terms of, Ms. Gutrich, you were mentioning the prioritization of the stations based on how much infrastructure investment they need and so on. The first 6 months of this rollout are going to be in the current fiscal year. So it sounds like. So are there budgeted funds available for those technological upgrades beyond what's already set aside in the UB, or is that sufficient to address those technological upgrades in the stations that you expect to do this fiscal year?
Everything that's requested in this budget is to cover all of the stations, regardless of when they will be deployed. So there will be no additional ask for infrastructure upgrades or anything like that in next fiscal year.
Well, no, I mean in the current fiscal year, since you're doing half of your installs in the second half of this fiscal year, is there sufficient money in this budget currently without change to meet those infrastructure needs?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I'm running out of steam here. Mr. Blumenfield, go ahead.
The deployment, what is the deployment in terms of how you decide which stations are getting it timing-wise?
So it's really about how long the infrastructure upgrades take at each station. So the stations where the infrastructure work can be completed rather quickly are up front. Those that require sort of a medium amount of work will be sort of in the middle of the deployment, and those where the infrastructure work is going to take some time, primarily because of the age of the station or some complexity around the getting the technology or the power into the station, are toward the end of the deployment schedule. So we lumped the stations basically into three categories. There's kind of easy, medium, and difficult, and that's how we came up with the deployment schedule.
Anything else? What's your pleasure, members? We're set to hear this on Wednesday in council, assuming public safety approves tomorrow and we approve today. And this has been a helpful discussion for me. I'd usually, as I say, like to have a lot higher comfort level in approving $55 million in a 5-year commitment than I have. But I think it's been a useful discussion. I for sure, regardless of what we do, one of the things I'd like to ask for is a thorough report back on the existing cameras that are out there, because we had a pilot program, and you've described, the officers' reactions to it, how the department assessed that, but that hasn't really been reported back to us, and I think it would be helpful to know what worked well, what didn't work so well, what were the reasons that led to the conclusion that Motorola is the right, that Taser is the right vendor, and so forth. That's kind of the point of having a pilot program. So I'd like to have some reporting back on that.
Before Tuesday?
No. It's not going to happen by Tuesday. Yeah.
On that front, is there anything that you all can share with us in terms of where the pilot program, I know we don't have a formal report, but,
Yeah.
and we all want to take this big leap of faith on it, but is anything you want to share with us in terms of how that's worked and what has worked and hasn't worked?
You want to speak a little bit to the deployment of the first 860 and how that went?
Sure. I'll even back up a little further. So when we did the first 30 cameras, 30 to 35 cameras in the divisions, we looked at a couple different varieties, gave them to the officers for 90 days, did both, and then retrieved all the cameras back and said, okay, we're going to write our report and take a look at, make a recommendation. During that time period, the officers at the station, in this case Central Division, sent their supervisors back to me personally and said, we realize you have to go through this process, but can you give us the cameras back because we liked them and we want to continue to deploy them, which was kind of completely different from when we first showed up at the station when they volunteered to do it. There's a lot of hesitancy, but then once they deployed them, they said, this really is great for us doing our job. We want them back. So in fact, we did. We gave them back while we did the rest of our reports. So for us, that was a really good sign that we were going in the right direction. In the 860 that we deployed, we've had similar experiences where the officers, as you can imagine, you introduce any new piece of technology, they're a little hesitant. What they really want to know is what they don't do, that the supervisors can't turn them on in the car or listen to their private conversations while they're driving around. So once we get past that, there's an acceptance of the technology itself. It's very simple to use, it's big buttons, not a whole lot of things for them to do. And we emphasize that it'll help them in their interaction with the community. It doesn't affect their tactics in any way, shape, or form. By them turning it on early and often, then they're no longer thinking about the camera. They turn it on, they deal with the public and the situation like they normally do. They wait for everything to be over, they turn it off. The feedback we've gotten is that they do like the fact that it's easy, that the cameras don't require a lot. They like that they simply slide it off at end of shift, drop it in those cradles that we described, and simply walk away from the device. When they come back the next morning, since it's assigned personally to them, it's fully charged, it's ready to go. They slide it back on, turn it on. It doesn't interfere with their daily activity, which is another thing that they like about it. Not a lot of cords and extra battery packs, things like that. What we have seen is specifically from the officers, they've given us instances where they've dealt with a group. For instance, they had a domestic violence incident where the actual person they were arresting was actually rather cooperative, but the family members around them weren't. So what they did is they told everybody in the room that they were being recorded with the camera. That de-escalated the overall incident, perhaps stopped a use of force that may or may not have occurred out of this incident, but in either case, they were able to use that to their advantage to de-escalate a particular incident, so they like that. Supervisors especially like it when they're called to an incident where an officer is involved in something and it's an agitated situation, because the supervisors, the first thing they say is, we're recording the entire incident and my officers have recorded it. How can I help you, ma'am or sir? So again, that helps de-escalate the particular incident.
And I would say in terms of lessons learned from the deployment itself, one of the things is just over time we fine-tuned the training, even on a daily basis, to make sure we're really hammering home policy in particular. As Sergeant Gomez said, the technology is rather simple to use. We can, in about an hour and a half roll call training, probably 20% of that is learning how to use the camera. The remainder of the 80% is really about policy and understanding the policy as it pertains to the camera. Some of the difficulties that we encountered in terms of the deployment focused really around that infrastructure work, not necessarily around GSD and the power, but more around making sure that ITA can get us connected to the network and get the proper switches installed and all of that. And that's why we've provided quite a bit of lead time on that in the proposed schedule. The infrastructure work actually is probably the lengthier part of the process. And then the last, I think, lesson learned I would mention is just while we had regular conversations with the city attorney and district attorney, I think the amount or the volume of video that was going to hit them with each of their cases wasn't really fully realized until it started coming. And so having those conversations about making sure we get the appropriate video to them as quickly as possible and as early as possible to help with considerations around pleas and case filings and the like so that we can help them earlier in their cases, I think is an area that we focused on quite a bit lately.
And on that point, that's a great example of where we as policymakers really benefit from that experience and that report back, because that may actually turn out to have a positive effect on the budget. You know, if we're able to resolve litigation more rapidly at a more at a lower cost, or outright get rid of cases that otherwise we would have settled, you know, there may be a positive budgetary impact to that. On the other hand, you've just described at length the significant review time and so forth, the personnel that are required to get to that point. I still don't have any way of assessing that, but we have an experience of several hundred cameras and a few months to get some sense of that. So, as we're looking at our workforce indicators for the 120 positions and so on, I would hope that will be informed by the experience that you've already had, and not just, not assumed based on other factors, but you already have now a little bit of a track record of experience to kind of judge on. And if there's information that we can get back about potential impacts that this may have and potential cost reduction impacts and so on, that would have been helpful. I don't see that we can do any of that in time to consider this by Wednesday. But
And quite frankly, I don't have those results for you yet because these 860 cameras were just deployed really in September and October.
Yeah.
So it's a little early to come back with results on prosecutions or civil filings or anything like that. That is part of the analysis that we'll be doing with the grant funding I mentioned from the National Institute of Justice in determining the impact of the cameras. So certainly as and we are working with private researchers and universities on that research, so it won't be the department evaluating itself. We really have third parties coming in to do that evaluation for us. And certainly as they prepare their reports, and they'll do periodic reports throughout the life of that grant, which is we have 2 more years on that grant. I'll make sure that we come back with those results and have those discussions. And I'm happy to ask some of the researchers to even come in and talk about what they've looked at.
Okay. And for example, if that report were to come back and then we look at it, we decide, this turns out to be really way more inconvenient than we expected. It's going to take way more people than we expected. We're going to have to supplement the budget in ways that we didn't anticipate. Is it safe for me to assume that, and I don't expect that we will do that, but that's what we have to consider, that possibility. If we were to make that decision, could we then, even after having approved this contract, could we then go to the termination for convenience clause and say, I know we're only in the second quarter of the first year, but we've decided that this is just going to cost us too much and we're going to have to terminate it?
Absolutely. We can terminate for convenience at any time based on really any decision. There doesn't have to be necessarily an explanation to the vendor at all as long as we provide that 30-day written notice. I will say that there are 2 major studies that have been produced already on the use of body cameras by some researchers who worked with other agencies who deployed cameras some time ago. And one was in Arizona where they found complaints against officers declined by 23%. After they deployed their cameras, and arrests actually increased by about 17%. And then the city of Rialto here locally has had cameras for a number of years. They published an initial study and then actually just came back with an update to their study. And they're using the same evidence.com solution that that we're proposing here, their complaints made by citizens against officers dropped by 88%, and their uses of force actually declined by 60%. So while I don't know if we'll see as drastic of numbers as that, we do hope to see numbers, moving in the right direction, and certainly with fewer uses of force and fewer complaints against officers, that should equate to fewer payouts and litigation in general.
Okay. So, members, I know Mr. Bonner made a request to hear from the chief by the time we vote. I know there's probably other things that you want to consider a little bit further, Mr. Blumenfield, on the IT front and otherwise. But I'm prepared to advance this forward to council on Wednesday so that our colleagues can consider it, and I know public safety needs to consider it tomorrow. Our thoughts in council might be informed by what they have to say as well. I would suggest, just because I don't know that I'm quite there yet in my gut, advancing it without a recommendation of budget and finance. And then hopefully we can spend the next 48 hours getting even more up to speed, and if so that we don't slow down the process. If that is acceptable to the two of you, that's what we'll do, and we'll hear what public safety has to say tomorrow. And thank you for all this time.
Thank you.
It's actually been very helpful. I appreciate it, and we'll go ahead and advance it to council. Is Mr. Herman still here? No, he's not? Okay. All right. He submitted a card. So just for the record, Mr. Herman will not be speaking on the. So, thank you.
We are adjourned.
Is there anything else before